the elderly man, entered the courtroom in handcuffs, his weathered face lowered. "Name?" asked the court clerk. He responded with a trembling voice. "Mason Quinn, Sergeant, United States Marine Corps." No one expected what happened next. A few minutes later, as the judge was reviewing her file, she suddenly froze. Her face lost all color. That name belonged to the man who had saved her brother's life on the battlefield of Fallujah before making the ultimate sacrifice. Respect if you believe that honor doesn't fade just because we grow old or poor. Mason Quinn, 69 years old, sat on the bench in the courtroom. His shoulders drooped under an outdated military jacket, 2 sizes too big. The harsh neon lights emphasized deep wrinkles, carved by the years and hardships of life, into his once proud face. Decades ago he had stood upright, in his service uniform, medals on his chest. Today he awaited judgment, in clothes, from a donation bin at the homeless shelter. The bailiff called his case. File 47B, City versus Mason Quinn. Disorderly conduct, trespassing, resisting arrest. Mason stepped forward, his movements stiff from arthritis and old injuries that had never properly healed. Vietnam first, then Iraq for his second tour. Visible and invisible wounds he had quietly carried for decades. "Mr. Quinn," began the prosecutor, a young man with perfect teeth, in a tailored suit, was repeatedly warned about making noise and causing disturbances behind the Jefferson Street Cafe. The owner has filed 3 complaints this month. What the prosecutor failed to mention was that Mason simply sat quietly behind the cafe, warming himself near the kitchen exhaust vent. On especially cold nights, he never begged for money, never disturbed customers. He simply sought a moment of warmth. When December temperatures fell below freezing, Officer James Reynolds, who had made the arrest, spoke next. "I found the defendant at 11:45 p.m. behind the cafe. He refused to leave the premises. When I ordered him to, Mason had not refused. He had simply asked for 5 more minutes to finish the half sandwich that the cook had secretly given him. But now arguing seemed pointless, just like back then." "Your Honor," said Prosecutor Ford, "this is the defendant's 3rd offense this year. We recommend community service and a 30-day exclusion order for the downtown business district. Such an exclusion would mean Mason would no longer have access to the homeless shelter on 4th Street, the only warm bed he had known for months. It would also mean no more meals at St. Luke's Church on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It would mean true isolation in the coldest months of winter. Mr. Quinn," Judge Olivia Parker addressed him directly, "do you have an attorney?" Mason shook his head. His assigned public defender was tied up in another courtroom with an emergency hearing. "Would you like to make a statement on your own behalf?" asked the judge, peering over her crescent-shaped reading glasses. Mason cleared his throat. His voice sounded rusty from rare use. "No excuses, Your Honor. I'm just trying to stay warm." "Is there a particular reason why you chose that specific place?" the judge asked further, an inscrutable expression on her face. "The cook." Mason hesitated. "Jimmy, he sometimes gives me food. I've known him since he was a child. His father served with me in the Gulf War." "And your military service?" Judge Parker asked, even though such information is usually not relevant in these proceedings. "United States Marine Corps, 1975 to 1995. Staff Sergeant, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines in Iraq." The words came automatically, a moment of clarity and pride. Amidst the confusion, the judge made a note and then continued, reviewing the file. Something in Mason's personal record seemed to catch her attention, but before she could respond, the courtroom doors opened, and a distinguished man in an expensive suit entered the room. He walked over to the defense table, placed a leather briefcase down, and addressed the court. Your Honor, Alexander Rossi for the defendant. I apologize for the interruption, but I've been assigned to represent Mr. Quinn. Mason looked up, confused. He hadn't hired anyone. He couldn't afford a lawyer, let alone one in such an expensive suit. This is highly irregular, noted Judge Parker. The court was not informed of this representation. It's a very recent development, Your Honor. Rossi responded calmly. I request a short recess to speak with my client. Judge Parker looked at the attorney, then at Mason, her expression unreadable. The court will take a 15-minute recess, she announced and abruptly stood to retreat into her chambers. Mason turned to the stranger beside him. I don't have money for a lawyer. You don't need any. Rossi answered quietly. The firm of Williams, Rossi and Parker is taking your case. Pro bono. Mason frowned at the familiar name. Parker like the judge. Just like the judge, Rossi confirmed. In her chambers, Judge Olivia Parker removed her glasses with trembling hands. 20 years on the bench had taught her to maintain composure, no matter what appeared before her. But nothing had prepared her for this moment. This can't be the same man, she whispered, though the details fit too perfectly. She opened the drawer of her desk and took out a worn photo, herself as a young woman, beside her brother, Lieutenant Jack Parker in his Marine uniform. His arm was around her shoulders. Both of them were laughing widely at his promotion ceremony. Jack's last letter from Iraq lay next to the photo, the paper thin from countless readings. In it, he described a firefight outside Fallujah, where his unit was under heavy fire. If it hadn't been for Staff Sergeant Quinn, Jack had written, none of us would have made it. He ran across open ground, under heavy fire, to help a fallen Marine. Then he laid down cover fire, so the wounded could be evacuated. 2 weeks after writing that letter, Jack was killed by an IED. Olivia remembered the military funeral, the folded flag, handed to her parents, and the Marine, who had approached her afterward. Your son saved my life, he had said. I was the one he pulled to safety before. The Marine hadn't finished the sentence. He didn't need to. That Marine's name had been Mason Quinn. After the funeral, Olivia had tried to contact him. She wanted to know more about her brother's final days. But the military explained that Sergeant Quinn had been immediately redeployed. Later investigations revealed that he had been honorably discharged after suffering severe post-traumatic stress disorder and a traumatic brain injury during his final deployment. And now, 20 years later, he was sitting in her courtroom, homeless, alone, unrecognized. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Alexander Rossi entered, a concerned look on his face. Olivia, what's wrong? He asked, as the former law partner of her late husband and a family friend. He was one of the few who called her by her first name. It's him, Alex, she replied, pointing at the photo. The Marine, who had saved Jack's life, who had carried him out under fire. Rossi's eyes widened as he made the connection. The homeless veteran in your courtroom. That's Mason Quinn, the one you've been trying to find for years. Olivia nodded. His service record confirms it. Fallujah, 2004. Same unit as Jack. For the operation Jack described in his letters, he was awarded the Silver Star. Does he know who you are? I don't think so. I married Thomas after law school and changed my name to Parker. It's been 20 years. She paused, collecting herself. What happened to him, Alex? How does a decorated Marine end up homeless, standing in my courtroom, just because he tried to warm himself up? Rossi shook his head. As far as I could gather from our brief conversation, he suffers from severe PTSD since his last deployment. His wife left him while he was deployed. His claims to the Veterans Affairs got lost in bureaucratic chaos. He worked in construction for years, until his combat injuries forced him to stop. Then came the typical downward spiral. job loss, foreclosure, and eventually the streets. Olivia closed her eyes, remembering her brother's words. Quinn is the best of us. Someone who would give everything for his comrades without hesitation. If I become even half the officer he is, then I'll consider myself a success. What will you do? Rossi asked gently. You could recuse yourself for conflict of interest. No, Olivia replied firmly. I won't let him disappear again. You know there are ethical concerns. I'm very aware of that, she answered, regaining her composure, as a judge should. But there are also ethical concerns about how we treat those who sacrificed everything for our country. When Judge Parker re-entered the courtroom, her posture was flawless, her expression neutral, but those who knew her well might have noticed a slight tremor in her hands as she arranged the papers before her. Mr. Rossi, has your client decided how he wants to proceed? She asked in a formal tone. The lawyer stepped forward. Your Honor, we request the dismissal of all charges. My client was merely trying to protect himself from life-threatening cold, a basic human need. Moreover, we can show that Mr. Quinn was on the premises with permission from the restaurant staff. The prosecutor began to object, but Judge Parker raised her hand slightly, silencing him before he could continue. I have several questions for the defendant, she said, turning her attention to Mason Quinn. Your military record shows a deployment to Fallujah in 2004. Correct. Mason straightened slightly, muscle memory from decades of military discipline, momentarily overcoming his current condition. Yes, Your Honor. 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. And on April 17, 2004, you were involved in an operation on the western outskirts of the city. Confusion crossed Mason's weathered face. Yes, ma'am. We were escorting a convoy when we came under heavy fire. During that firefight, the judge continued with remarkable steadiness. You rescued a wounded Marine, Lieutenant Jack Parker, under enemy fire. The courtroom fell silent. Mason's eyes narrowed as memories rose within him. Lieutenant Parker, he repeated slowly. Yes, young officer, a good man. He was hit while trying to reach an injured medic. I got to him, dragged him behind a wall. He kept saying, I should leave him and save the others first. In the gallery, a silver-haired man, in a Marine Corps League jacket, suddenly leaned forward, clearly gripped by the moment. And what happened to Lieutenant Parker? Judge Olivia Parker asked, her professional expression unchanged, though her insides trembled. We got him to medevac, Mason replied. His voice dropped. I later heard he made it to Germany and was back on patrol a few weeks later. His vehicle hit an IED. Mason's voice broke slightly. All these years I've wondered if I did more harm than good by pulling him out, just for him to die later. The silver-haired Marine in the gallery suddenly stood, unable to contain himself. That's him, he shouted. That's Staff Sergeant Quinn. I was there that day. He saved 6 of us. Judge Parker struck her gavel sharply. Order, she commanded, but her voice lacked its usual authority. The courtroom slowly settled down, while tension still vibrated in the air. Mason Quinn looked down, embarrassed, uncomfortable with the sudden attention. The silver-haired Marine remained standing. With all due respect, Your Honor, the prosecutor interjected. As honorable as Mr. Quinn's military service may be, it has no relevance to this proceeding. The court sees it differently. Judge Parker interrupted. It has every relevance. She deliberately set the gavel down. This court will take a 10-minute recess. Bailiff, please ensure Mr. Quinn remains in the courtroom. As she turned to leave, she paused and, unusually for a judge, made direct eye contact with the defendant. Mr. Quinn, when I return, there are things we need to discuss, things that go beyond this charge. In her chambers, Olivia's professional facade finally crumbled. With trembling fingers, She pressed her hand to her lips, holding back emotions that had been buried for 20 years. After several deep breaths, she reached for the phone. "Colonel Matthews, this is Olivia Parker. Yes, I know it's been a long time. I need a favor." Immediately, exactly 10 minutes later, Judge Parker returned to the courtroom. She was not alone. 3 uniformed Marines followed her in: a colonel, a master sergeant, and a corporal holding a polished wooden case. The courtroom buzzed. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Mason Quinn stood up instinctively, military reflex overriding his physical discomfort. Judge Parker took her seat, looked over the full courtroom, and, for the first time in her career, removed her glasses and set them aside. She no longer spoke as a judge, but as a human being. "Before we proceed, I must disclose a personal connection to this case. The Lieutenant Jack Parker, whom the defendant spoke of, was my brother." A loud gasp swept through the courtroom. Mason's eyes widened, a mix of realization and disbelief. 20 years ago, my brother wrote to our family about a staff sergeant who saved his life in Fallujah, a man who ran through enemy fire to reach him after he was wounded, and who continued to lay down cover fire so others could get to safety. Her voice remained remarkably steady. "That man was Sergeant Mason Quinn." The silver-haired Marine in the gallery called out. "It's true, Your Honor. I was there." Quinn was hit twice while the lieutenant stepped forward to support Judge Parker, who gave him a nod of thanks. 2 weeks after that incident, my brother was killed in action. She continued. At his funeral, several Marines approached our family, sharing stories of Jack's courage, but also telling us about the staff sergeant who saved him during that earlier firefight. Because of that man, we had 2 more weeks with Jack. 2 weeks we never would have had. She now looked directly at Mason. "After my brother's death, I tried to find you, Sergeant Quinn. The Marine Corps informed me you had immediately returned to active duty. Years later, I was told you had been honorably discharged, but they would not disclose your whereabouts." Mason stood perfectly still. His weathered face was a mask of conflicting emotions. "I never stopped looking." Judge Parker continued, "And now, through what can only be called fate, or divine intervention, you stand here, in my courtroom." She gestured toward the colonel, who now stepped forward. "Colonel James Matthews was my brother's commanding officer. He has something to say." Colonel Matthews approached the judge's bench. "Staff Sergeant Quinn, the Marine Corps has been trying to locate you for years. Your file was one of thousands reviewed under the Veterans Reassessment Initiative. New information about your deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan required a reevaluation of your commendations and eligibility for benefits." A private stepped forward and opened the wooden case he was carrying. Inside gleamed a medal on a blue ribbon. "In the name of the Secretary of the Navy, and in recognition of extraordinary bravery and determination in combat, on April 17, 2004, Staff Sergeant Mason J. Quinn of the United States Marine Corps is hereby awarded the Navy Cross." A stunned murmur rippled through the courtroom. The Navy Cross is the second highest military decoration in the U.S. Armed Forces after the Medal of Honor. Recently declassified intelligence confirms, Colonel Matthews explained, that your actions on that day not only saved Lieutenant Parker and 5 other Marines, but also foiled an ambush that could have destroyed the entire convoy. Your Silver Star has accordingly been upgraded. Mason's stoic expression finally broke. "This must be a mistake," he said hoarsely. "I was just doing my duty." "No mistake, Sergeant," the colonel confirmed. "This honor is long overdue." From the gallery, a voice called out, "Attention!" The silver-haired Marine and several others in civilian clothes, recognizable by their bearing, stood upright and saluted Mason Quinn one by one. One after another, the entire courtroom stood. Even the prosecutor, torn between protocol and decency, rose with sincere respect. Judge Parker, now with tears in her eyes, spoke in a trembling voice. In light of these circumstances, all charges against Staff Sergeant Mason Quinn are hereby dismissed with prejudice. She struck her gavel. This court is adjourned. After the formalities concluded, the Master Sergeant approached Mason with a tablet. Sir, we've been trying to contact you to update your VA benefits. Your disability rating has been retroactively assessed at 100% service-connected, effective from your discharge date. What does that mean? Mason asked, still overwhelmed. It means substantial back pay, sir, as well as full medical coverage, housing allowance, and educational benefits, if you choose to use them. Alexander Rossi stepped forward. And our firm will ensure everything is processed immediately, Mr. Quinn. No more bureaucratic delays. From the back of the courtroom, Jimmy the cook, who had often brought Mason meals, approached with tears in his eyes. My father always said there was a Marine who saved his entire unit. And he told me, if I ever met a Mason Quinn, I owed him everything. He held out his hand. I never thought it was you. All this time, even the prosecutor, visibly moved, approached Mason. Sir, I had no idea. Please accept my sincere apology for how this case was handled. Mason stood in the middle of the sudden wave of attention, a posture slowly returning to him, as if the weight of unacknowledged honor had finally been lifted from his shoulders. Judge Parker stepped down from the bench, setting aside her professional distance. She walked up to Mason. Her voice was soft, but clear. My brother wrote to me that you said something. When you pulled him to safety, you said, no Marine gets left behind, as long as I breathe. Today, Sergeant Quinn, we're finally fulfilling that promise for you. 2 weeks later, Mason Quinn stood in front of a mirror, in an apartment he still couldn't believe was his. The Veterans Housing Program had expedited his case and placed him in a studio apartment within a complex specifically designed for formerly homeless veterans. The walls were bare, except for one framed display, the newly awarded Navy Cross, presented in a shadow box, alongside his original Purple Hearts and service medals that Alexander Rossi had somehow recovered from a storage unit auctioned off years ago. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Judge Olivia Parker stood in the hallway, without her robe, holding a small box in her hand. May I come in, Sergeant Quinn? She asked. Mason let her in, still a little overwhelmed by his new reality. Please, just Mason, Your Honor. Then I'm just Olivia, she replied with a small smile. At least outside my courtroom. They sat in the modest living area. The awkwardness of their unusual connection hung in the air. I brought something I thought you might want to see this, Olivia said as she opened the small box and took out a bundle of letters. These are from Jack. He wrote to our family every week while he was deployed. She handed Mason one letter. This one mentions you specifically. It was written the day after the incident, the day you saved him. Mason's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper. Lieutenant Parker's handwriting was neat and precise, just like Mason remembered it from the mission reports. Mom and Dad, Mason read aloud, don't worry about what you're seeing on the news. I'm okay, thanks to one of our NCOs. Staff Sergeant Quinn did something yesterday that I still can't quite believe. When our unit was hit, he moved through gunfire that would have dropped anyone else. He didn't leave me behind, even when I ordered him to. He said, no Marine gets left behind on my watch. Mason's voice caught. He wrote about you often, Olivia said softly. He said you were the kind of Marine he hoped to become himself. He was a good officer, Mason replied. Young, but he cared about his men. That's rare. After we lost Jack, Olivia continued, I went to law school. She gestured around the apartment. All of this, the Veterans Court Program, the housing initiative, it all started because of what Jack wrote about you. about how even heroes can sometimes be failed by the system. Mason looked away, uneasy with so much recognition. I'm not a hero. I just did what needed to be done. That's what heroes always say, Olivia replied gently. She hesitated for a moment, then continued, there's something else you should know. The day Jack died, he was leading a patrol to track down an insurgent group that had been targeting civilians. He volunteered for that mission. His last letter to us said he was trying to live up to the example you had set for him. The revelation hit Mason harder than any physical blow ever could. For 20 years, he had carried the weight of survival, wondering if saving the lieutenant had only delayed the inevitable, whether his efforts in the chaos of war had even made a difference. He didn't die because of you, Olivia said, as if reading his thoughts. He lived the way he did because of you. They sat in silence, two people bound by loss and honor. Across the decades, outside, gentle snow began to fall, blanketing the city in quiet white. Finally, Mason spoke, his voice barely a whisper. All those years on the street, I thought no one remembered, that none of it mattered anymore. It meant everything, Olivia assured him. To Jack, to the other Marines, to me. As she prepared to leave, Olivia gently placed a hand on Mason's shoulder. Jack always said that the true worth of a Marine isn't shown by what he does when everyone's watching, but by what he does when no one is. You lived that truth, even when the world turned its back. Mason stood taller than he had in years. A quiet dignity returned to his posture. Someone remembered my name, he said simply. After all this time, someone remembered. In that silent moment, something long broken began to heal, not just for Mason Quinn, but for everyone whose lives had been touched by his unrecognized honor. Some people save others from death, but spend their whole lives waiting to be saved themselves from being forgotten. Honor doesn't need glory. Sometimes just one moment of recognition is enough to help someone stand tall again. No one deserves to be left behind. Every person deserves to be heard and respected. If you believe that too, comment respect to show that you stand for kindness and justice. And don't forget to subscribe to Heart Echoes to hear more stories that touch the heart.